It began not with a bang, but with a whisper. A ghost of a sound passed through the labyrinthine corridors of power in the west, a faint echo from the other side of the Iron Curtain that seemed too fantastical, too contrary to the known laws of physics and aeronautics, to be given any credence. In the mid-1960s, the Cold War was a theater not just of missiles and ideologies, but of shadows and echoes. In Langley, Virginia, at the CIA's headquarters, and in the offices of NATO intelligence in Brussels, men in crisp suits, veterans of a war fought not with rifles but with filing cabinets and photo analyzers, began to hear things. The whispers were fragmented, often contradictory, arriving via defectors with shaky memories, from intercepted communications that were frustratingly vague, from agents in place who risked everything for a snippet of conversation overheard in a Moscow-designed bureau. The core of the rumor was always the same, and it was always absurd. The Soviets, it was said, were building a helicopter. This in itself was not news. The MiL-Mi-4, codenamed Hound by NATO, was a known and capable workhorse, a familiar sight in intelligence photographs. But this new thing, this was something else entirely. It was a helicopter of such staggering proportions, of such impossible scale, that it seemed to belong more to the pages of a science fiction pulp magazine than to a sober intelligence assessment. The whispers claimed it wasn't just large, it was monumental. A flying leviathan. A machine that could, according to one particularly breathless report, lift more weight than a C-130 Hercules transport plane, a aircraft with 4 massive turboprop engines. Another fragment suggested its payload capacity rivaled that of some Western strategic bombers. To the engineers and aerodynamics experts in the West, this was not just improbable, it was laughable. The fundamental principles of rotary wing flight were immutable, a brutal calculus of physics that no political decree from the Kremlin could override. Lift was generated by the rotor disc, the great circle described by the spinning blades. To lift more, you needed a larger disc area or you needed to spin the blades faster. But there were limits. The centrifugal forces involved were astronomical. A rotor system large enough to hoist the tonnage being described would be so immense, so heavy, that its own weight would be its undoing. The torque, the Newtonian equal and opposite reaction that tries to spin the helicopter's fuselage in the opposite direction of the rotor, would be like a giant's hand twisting the entire airframe into a pretzel of shredded aluminum. No transmission system yet conceived by man could withstand such forces. The gearboxes would simply melt, the gears shattering into 1,000 useless fragments. The very idea was an engineering impossibility. The initial reaction within the hallowed halls of NATO intelligence was a collective, dismissive shake of the head. It was filed away, given a dry classification, and largely forgotten. It was, they concluded, a classic case of Soviet exaggeration, a deliberate disinformation campaign designed to waste Western time and resources. It was a Potemkin village of the skies, a phantom meant to project an image of technological prowess where none existed. The Soviets were good at that. They had a history of rolling out gargantuan prototypes for parades, machines that were more spectacle than substance. This, the analysts assured themselves, was surely more of the same. But the whispers, like a stubborn ghost, refused to be silenced. They didn't fade away, they grew. They became more detailed, more persistent. New reports trickled in, not just from human sources but from signals intelligence. There were mentions of a new design bureau project, not under the famed Mikhail Mill, but under another brilliant, if less publicized, mind, Marit Tishchenko. There were intercepted logistical requests for specialized high-tensile strength steel alloys and titanium components in quantities that suggested a project of unprecedented scale. There were even vague, unconfirmed sightings from Finnish border guards who reported seeing something massive and slow-moving in the distant Soviet skies, a shape that blotted out the stars, its sound a deep, resonant thrum that was felt in the chest more than heard with the ears. The rumor was no longer just a rumor, it was an itch that the intelligence community couldn't quite scratch. And in the shadowy world of Cold War intelligence, an itch like that had a way of festering. A shadow on the radar. The Baltic Sea, autumn 1967. The air at 35,000 feet is thin and cold, a crystalline void where the sky bleeds from deep blue to the black of space. Here, in this silent, sunlit realm, a lone aircraft prowls, its path a careful, calculated dance just outside the territorial waters of the Soviet Union. This is a RC-135U, Combat Cent, a modified Boeing Stratoliner that is less an airplane and more a flying laboratory packed with the most advanced electronic intelligence gathering equipment in the Western world. Its skin is peppered with unexplained bulges and blisters, housing antennas that can listen to 1,000 different frequencies at once, from the chatter of a ground controller to the faint squeal of a radar's search beam. Inside, the atmosphere is a study in focused intensity. The low hum of the engines is a constant backdrop, a vibration felt through the deck plates. The air smells of ozone, warmed electronics, and stale coffee. The crew, a mix of Air Force officers and civilian technical specialists, are at their stations, their faces illuminated by the soft green glow of radar scopes and the warmer light of oscilloscopes. They are hunters of the invisible, fishing for electronic ghosts in the ether. Their prey, the Soviet Union's air defense network, a vast and intricate web of radars, SAM sites, and command centers. They map signal patterns, identify new frequencies, and log every electronic heartbeat of the potential enemy. On this particular mission, the primary focus is a new Soviet early warning radar site being constructed on the coast of the Baltic, near the city of Riga. The mission commander, a veteran major named David Shaw, is monitoring the main console when his senior radar operator, a young but preternaturally gifted sergeant named Ed Miller, speaks up, his voice cutting through the routine chatter on the intercom. "Skip, I've got something odd." Shaw leans over, his eyes scanning the phosphorescent screen. The usual landscape of returns is there, the coastline, a few commercial airliners on their routes, the predictable clutter of weather. But there's a new blip, much closer to the coast than they usually see traffic. It's not following any established airway. It's slow, incredibly slow for an aircraft, moving at a pace that suggests a heavy transport plane or perhaps a large helicopter. But the return signature is all wrong. "Identify?" Shaw asks, his voice calm, professional. "That's just it, sir," Miller replies, his finger tracing the blob of light. "IFF is non-existent. It's not squawking any transponder code we have on file. And the cross-section, it's huge. But it's not shaped like a bear or a bison." He was referring to the Soviet Tu-95 bomber and MYA-4 transport, both large aircraft with distinctive radar profiles. It's blocky, like a shipping container. But it's moving, and climbing. The crew's attention is now fully on the anomaly. They vector the RC-135's most powerful side-looking array towards the contact. The return sharpens, but its shape remains baffling. It isn't streamlined. It lacks the elegant, predatory lines of a bomber or the long, tubular fuselage of a transport. On the screen, it appears as a dense, almost square mass of light, with smaller, separate returns whirling around it, the telltale signature of massive rotor blades. "Helicopter," someone mutters. "Has to be. But the size. My God, the size of it." They calculate the radar cross-section. The numbers they come up with are off the scale, comparable to that of a small naval vessel. The thing is moving at a stately, deliberate pace of about 150 knots, climbing slowly but steadily, a behemoth unconcerned with haste. It is a flying object that, according to every database and every technical manual aboard the RC-135, should not, could not, exist. For 20 minutes, they track it, a silent, unseen audience to a performance they cannot comprehend. They record every scrap of data, every flicker of its electronic presence. The atmosphere in the cabin is a mixture of professional exhilaration and profound unease. They have just looked into the heart of the Soviet machine and seen something new, something their own science told them was impossible. The pilot, a laconic Californian named Captain Jock Miles, who has been listening to the technical chatter on his headset, finally keys his intercom. His voice, dry and laced with the dark humor that is the pilot's defense against the surreal, breaks the tension. "Well, boys," he drawls. "Either the Soviets are flying hangars now, or our brand new $1 million radar is broken." A nervous chuckle ripples through the cabin. But they all knew. The radar wasn't broken. They had just seen a ghost given form. The whisper had a shape. The rumor had a shadow. And in that moment, the intelligence calculus of the Cold War shifted irrevocably. The file was pulled from the cabinet, the classification upgraded. The hunt for the Soviet giant, the helicopter that defied reality, had officially begun. They would soon give it a name, a codename born from the imposing, brutalist simplicity they saw on their scopes. They would call it the Homer, but in their minds, it was something far more primal. It was a monster. The Kazakh steppe in late spring is a vast, flat expanse of bleached grass and hard-baked earth, a landscape that seems to go on forever under an immense, porcelain blue sky. The air shimmers with heat, and the only sounds are the whisper of the wind and the distant cry of a hawk. It is a place of profound silence and emptiness, a perfect canvas for secrets. In the late 1960s, this desolation was punctuated by the presence of the Soviet Union's most sensitive aerospace testing facilities, remote, secure, and hidden from prying eyes. Here, at a site known only by a sterile alphanumeric designation, the whispers and the radar shadow were finally given a name, a form, a terrifying, physical reality. The day of the unveiling was not marked by a grand press conference or a military parade. There was no fanfare for the outside world. The audience was a small, select group of high-ranking Communist Party officials, stone-faced generals from the Red Army, and the brilliant, exhausted engineers who had poured a decade of their lives into this project. They stood on a hastily erected reviewing platform, a stark wooden structure against the timeless steppe. The atmosphere was thick with tension and the smell of diesel fuel and dust. These men were not given to emotional displays, but even among the hardened generals, there was a palpable sense of anticipation, a feeling of standing on the precipice of history. Then, it was towed out from a gargantuan hangar, a structure so large its doors looked like the gates of a mythical city. It emerged slowly, pulled by two heavy trucks, a colossal shape emerging from the shadows into the harsh Central Asian sun. A low murmur rippled through the assembled dignitaries. The grainy, long-lens photographs smuggled to the west had not done it justice. They had failed to capture its sheer, overwhelming presence. This was the MiL V-12. NATO would later assign it the reporting name, Homer, a bland, almost insulting moniker for such a beast. To the men on the platform, it was simply Izdeliye 65, Product 65. But names and numbers could not contain it. It was, quite simply, the largest helicopter ever built by human hands, a machine that looked less like an aircraft and more like a piece of architectural folly, a cathedral of aviation that had somehow become unmoored from the earth. Its fuselage was not the sleek, streamlined tube of a conventional helicopter. It was a vast, rectangular box, a flying warehouse, painted in a dull, functional military green. It was as long as a Boeing 737 airliner, a fact that the mind struggled to reconcile with its vertical takeoff capability. At the front, the cockpit was a multi-paned greenhouse perched 3 stories high, a dizzying height that required the crew to ascend a long, spindly retractable stairway that folded down from the belly, like knights boarding some mechanized dragon. The cockpit windows, from a distance, looked like the suspicious eyes of a giant insect. But the most staggering features, the elements that defied all conventional helicopter design, were the wings. Helicopters do not have wings, they have rotor pylons. But the V-12 had full, cantilevered wings, like those of a fixed-wing transport, sweeping out from its bloated fuselage. And at the end of each wing, mounted in a massive, streamlined nacelle, was a 5-bladed rotor system. Each rotor was a masterpiece of wood and metal composite, a set of blades so long they looked like the sails of some ancient windmill. The diameter of each rotor disc was over 35 meters. Standing beneath one, a man would have been dwarfed, an ant looking up at a spinning steel forest. The distance from the tip of one rotor to the tip of the other was greater than the wingspan of a jumbo jet. The entire configuration, the side-by-side rotors, was a direct, brutalist solution to the problem of torque. Instead of fighting the physics with a tail rotor, the V-12's designers, led by Marat Tishchenko at the MiL Moscow helicopter plant, had embraced a different, far more complex path. The two main rotors would spin in opposite directions, their opposing torques canceling each other out. It was brilliantly simple in theory, but a nightmare of mechanical complexity in practice. The synchronization had to be perfect, a ballet of meshing gears and drive shafts running through the wings, orchestrated by a transmission system of monstrous proportions. A miscalculation of a fraction of a second, a single fatigued gear tooth, and the two sets of blades would inevitably meet in a cataclysmic mid-air collision, shredding the entire aircraft into a cloud of confetti. As it sat on the tarmac, its immense weight resting on a complex tricycle landing gear with multiple wheels, it seemed inert, a static sculpture of ambition. But the 4 Soloviev D-25VF turboshaft engines, 2 in each nacelle, were silent promises of power. Each engine produced 6,500 shaft horsepower, a combined total that could light a small city. The air around the machine seemed to hum with potential energy. It did not look like a helicopter. It looked like a machine built by a country that had stared at the word, impossible, scratched it out of the dictionary, and written in its place, my Budem Delit, Chto Kodem, we will do what we want. The impossible first flight. In the West, the first grainy, long-range photographs of the V-12, smuggled out by a courageous agent or perhaps snatched by a Corona spy satellite passing overhead, were met with a combination of derision and profound skepticism. The design was so unorthodox, so seemingly counterintuitive, that Western aviation experts refused to believe it was a functional aircraft. It had to be a mock-up, they argued, a maskerovka, a deception, built to intimidate and mislead. The physics simply wouldn't allow it. The core of their disbelief lay in the twin-rotor system. While the concept of counter-rotating rotors was known, the American CH-47 Chinook used a tandem rotor setup. The V-12's side-by-side configuration was a different beast entirely. The ground effect, the cushion of air beneath a hovering aircraft, would be chaotic and unpredictable. The rotor discs, spinning in such close proximity, would create incredibly complex and turbulent vortices. The downwash from one rotor would interfere with the lift of the other. The aerodynamic forces acting on those long, Flexible wings, with the immense weight and gyroscopic forces of the rotors at their tips, were a calculus problem from hell. The synchronization of the rotors, as mentioned, was the holy grail of the design. The mechanical linkage connecting the two rotor systems had to be perfectly rigid, a feat of engineering that many in the West believed was beyond contemporary Soviet materials science. "It's a static display piece," one analyst was quoted as saying. "A hangar queen. It will never fly." But the Soviets were not in the habit of building multi-million ruble static displays. The proof was there, on the sun-baked tarmac of the Kazakh test range. The day of the first public demonstration, a key moment to prove the project's viability to its political patrons in Moscow, had arrived. The air was still. A handful of Western intelligence assets, their identities buried deep within the Soviet system, were present, their hearts pounding, knowing they were about to witness either a monumental triumph or a catastrophic, very public failure. The crew, test pilots and engineers, moved with a quiet, methodical calm. They were the best in the Soviet Union, men who had spent countless hours in the simulator, men who understood the beast's every quirk and tremor. They climbed the tall stairway into the cockpit, a process that itself seemed like a ritual. The hatch closed with a definitive thud. A signal was given. Ground crews, tiny figures against the machine's bulk, scurried away. Then, a low, guttural whine began to emanate from the nacelles. It was a sound that was felt more than heard, a deep vibration that traveled up through the soles of the feet of the men on the reviewing stand. The four turbines spooled up, the whine building into a roar, then a shriek that tore the silence of the steppe to shreds. The air behind the rotors began to distort, shimmering with heat and turbulence. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the colossal rotors began to turn. They did not spin with the blurring speed of a conventional helicopter. Their size dictated a slower, more stately rotation, a motion of immense, deliberate power. The whump-whump-whump of the blades cutting the air was a physical pressure on the eardrums, a primal drumbeat that resonated in the chest cavity. Dust and debris were whipped up from the tarmac in a furious, expanding circle, a localized storm generated by the machine. The Western analysts watching through powerful telescopic lenses from a discrete distance held their breath. This was the moment. This was where the physics would reassert itself. This was where the rotors would clash, or the gearbox would fail, or the airframe would shudder itself to pieces. They waited for the wobble, the fight for control, the telltale signs of a machine at war with the natural order. It never came. With a calm that was almost unnerving, the V-12 simply rose. The landing gear compressed slightly, then extended as the weight came off the wheels. The immense machine lifted from the ground as smoothly as an elevator, straight up, with no lateral movement, no struggle. It was a display of stability that was utterly baffling. It climbed to a low hover, perhaps 50 feet above the ground, and hung there, solid as a rock, a man-made mountain suspended in the sky. The only movement was the slow, relentless turning of the rotors and the shimmering heat haze from the engines. It was not flying despite its size, it was flying because of it. Its mass gave it an inherent stability, a gyroscopic inertia that smoothed out the turbulence. The complex synchronization system, the product of years of secretive engineering, was working flawlessly. The two rotors, spinning in their perfect, opposing dance, were generating a lift force that was, to all who witnessed it, magical. For 10 minutes, it performed a series of gentle maneuvers, a slow turn to the left, a drift to the right, a cautious forward flight. It was not a nimble aircraft, but it was a supremely confident one. It moved with the ponderous, unstoppable grace of a glacier. Back in the West, when the first detailed reports and clearer film footage finally made it through the intelligence pipeline, the reaction was one of stunned, silent disbelief. The initial assessments were rewritten. The mock-up theory was discarded. In a classified memo from a NATO technical advisory group, an analyst, a man who had previously been one of the V-12's most vocal skeptics, penned a sentence that would become legendary in aviation intelligence circles. It was a simple, stark admission of defeat in the face of a concrete reality they had deemed impossible. The sentence read, "This should not be airborne." But it was. And in that moment, the balance of aerial logistical power, a key component of Cold War strategy, had been fundamentally challenged. The Soviets had not just built a big helicopter, they had built a flying proof of concept that their engineering could achieve the unbelievable. The Homer was real, and it was in the air. The air at the Flight Research Institute in Zhukovsky was thin and cold, a biting February chill that seeped through the heaviest of winter coats. It was 1969, a year of global tumult and technological leaps, but on this isolated Soviet airfield, all of human history had narrowed to a single point of focus: the colossal, green-painted shape of the MiL V-12, registration number 21142. The machine sat on the snow-dusted tarmac, its shadow a long, dark bruise against the pristine white. Today was not a day for gentle hovering or cautious maneuvers. Today was the day the Soviets intended to prove, once and for all, that their flying Leviathan was not merely an aerodynamic curiosity but a weapon of strategic utility. Today was about numbers. The atmosphere was one of intense, clinical focus, a stark contrast to the political grandstanding of earlier unveilings. This was an official Fédération Aéronautique Internationale (FAI) record attempt, witnessed by international officials. The world would have to accept the data. The crew, led by test pilot Vasily Kolochenko, were all business, their faces grim as they conducted the final pre-flight checks. The mission profile was deceptively simple: lift a payload to a height of 2,000 meters. The devil, as always, was in the details. The payload was not an abstract number on a clipboard. It was a solid, tangible mass of steel and concrete, carefully calibrated and secured within the vast, echoing cavern of the V-12's cargo hold. The weight had been meticulously measured and certified by the FAI officials: 40,204.5 kilograms. Over 44 tons. The equivalent of an entire railroad boxcar, fully loaded. Or 35 family sedans. Or the complete atomic weight of NATO's assumptions about Soviet heavy lift capability. Western observers, present under strict protocols, watched with a mixture of professional detachment and profound dread. They had seen it fly, but this was different. This was quantification. This was the translation of a terrifying possibility into cold, hard, indisputable metric tons. They knew what their own industry was capable of. The American CH-54 Skycrane, a formidable heavy lifter in its own right, could manage about 10 tons. The V-12 was aiming to quadruple that. It was an ambition that bordered on arrogance. The engines fired up, the familiar, earth-shaking whine building to a crescendo that seemed to make the very air vibrate. The rotors began their slow, powerful turn, churning up a blizzard of powdered snow and ice, enveloping the giant in a self-generated storm. The observers shielded their eyes, their notebooks forgotten, their entire world reduced to the sight of that immense machine straining against the bonds of gravity. It seemed to squat, to dig in, as if gathering its strength. Then, with that same impossible, smooth confidence it had displayed before, it began to rise. It was not a rapid ascent. This was not a fighter jet scrambling for altitude. This was a geological event in slow motion. It climbed steadily, purposefully, a mountain detaching itself from the earth. The sound was a physical force, a deep, resonant thrumming that was felt in the bones of every person on the ground. It climbed through 500 meters, then 1,000. The figures were called out over the radio, each one a nail in the coffin of Western heavy lift supremacy. It passed 2,000 meters, then 2,500. It kept climbing, a show of sheer, unadulterated power that was as much a political statement as a technical one. It finally reached its peak at 2,255 meters, over 7,400 feet. It hung there for a moment, a 44-ton challenge suspended in the icy Soviet air, before beginning its slow, controlled descent. When the V-12 settled back onto its landing gear, the shockwave that rolled through the international aviation community was more powerful than any sonic boom. The record was certified, official, and utterly unchallengeable. The United States had nothing. Europe had nothing. China had nothing. The record wasn't just broken, it was atomized, set at a level so stratospheric it seemed to belong to another era. The numbers were so absurd they were almost comical: 44,205 kilograms to 2,255 meters. It was a record that, decades later, would still stand, a monument to a brief, insane moment when the Soviets had attempted to bend the very sky to their will. Even among the Soviet team, the success was met with a kind of stunned silence that quickly gave way to quiet, disbelieving euphoria. They had known the theory, they had trusted the math, but witnessing the practical application was something else entirely. One test engineer, a man who had spent a decade of his life wrestling with the machine's countless complexities, was later quoted in a closed-circle debrief, his words capturing the surreal nature of their achievement. "After we saw the certified numbers, we looked at each other. There were no cheers, not at first. It was a silence. We realized we had built something no one else had dared to try. The V-12 was no longer just large. It was strategically terrifying. It had moved from being an engineering marvel to a geopolitical fact." NATO's quiet panic. In the warm, carpeted offices of the Pentagon and the Situation Rooms of NATO headquarters in Brussels, the certified FAI record data landed not as a piece of sporting news, but as a strategic bombshell. The grainy footage from Kazakhstan had been concerning. The radar returns had been alarming. But this was a spreadsheet of doom. The rumors were no longer funny. The abstract was now concrete, weighed in at 44 tons. The analysts who had once filed the reports under Soviet exaggeration now found their careers, and indeed the security of the Western alliance, hinging on understanding the implications of this machine. Panic is a quiet thing at these levels. It does not involve raised voices or overturned desks. It manifests in the sudden scheduling of emergency briefings, in the ashen faces of four-star generals, in the frantic scratching of pens on yellow legal pads. The question was no longer if the V-12 could fly, but what it could do. A helicopter of this size wasn't just a bigger truck, it was a tool that threatened to rewrite the entire book on Soviet military mobility, a core pillar of NATO's defense strategy. Teams of analysts worked around the clock, their coffee-stained reports painting a frightening new picture of the battlefield. The V-12, they concluded, was a logistical wizard, a genie that could grant the Soviet high command wishes previously considered impossible. It could deploy entire medium-range ballistic missile systems, like the SS-20 Sabre, to remote, unprepared locations in the Siberian taiga or the Mongolian plateau. NATO's satellites tracked roads and railways. They couldn't track a flight path that could deposit a fully assembled missile and its launch support vehicle in a forest clearing 100 miles from the nearest trail. It could move armored vehicles without roads. A BMD airborne combat vehicle, with its crew inside, could be plucked from one side of a mountain range and deposited on the other, bypassing NATO's heavily fortified choke points in Central Europe. Imagine the shock of a NATO battalion commander seeing Soviet armor appearing on his vulnerable flank, where no roads existed. It could airlift entire mobile radar stations, like the Tall King early warning radar, to the very edge of the Arctic Circle, plugging gaps in the Soviet air defense network almost overnight. The DU line, the distant early warning line in North America, suddenly seemed a lot less distant. It could construct ICBM bases in places NATO couldn't track or preemptively target. The components for hardened silos, the massive concrete emplacements, the command and control bunkers, all of it could be flown in, piece by colossal piece, to a location chosen precisely for its obscurity. It could reinforce divisions deep in Siberia overnight. The vast, roadless expanse of the Soviet Far East was no longer a logistical barrier but a hidden highway. A regiment of troops, with their light artillery and vehicles, could be shifted from Chita to the Chinese border in a handful of sorties, presenting Beijing with a fait accompli. The threat was not that the V-12 was a gunship, it was a force multiplier of unimaginable potency. It threatened to make NATO's meticulously crafted maps obsolete. It turned geographical strong points into vulnerable backdoors. It promised the Soviets a speed and flexibility of deployment that could overwhelm the West's ability to respond. The single, haunting question that echoed through the soundproofed briefing rooms was a simple one, born of this new and terrifying uncertainty: how many were they building? Was this a lone prototype, a technological flagship with no real fleet? Or was it, as the worst-case scenarios predicted, the first of 100 such machines, the vanguard of a new Soviet vertical maneuver army? The answer would determine everything. The balance of the Cold War, it seemed, now hung not just on the count of missiles in their silos, but on the count of these impossible, sky-blackening helicopters rolling off a secret production line somewhere deep behind the Urals. The hunt for that number became the most urgent intelligence priority of the day. Behind the triumphant headlines in Pravda and the stunned silence in the West, a different, more complicated reality was taking shape within the hallowed, secretive halls of the Mil Moscow helicopter plant. The V-12, designated Izdeliye 65, was more than a machine, it was an ecosystem of complexity, and that ecosystem was beginning to reveal its inherent fragilities. The initial euphoria of the record-breaking flight slowly gave way to the grinding, pragmatic realities of Soviet economics and strategic evolution. A secret was growing, shared in hushed tones between engineers in drafty corridors and muttered by logistics officers staring at daunting supply manifests. The V-12 was incredible, a testament to what they could achieve, but it was too incredible for its own good. Its very size, the source of its awe-inspiring capability, was its primary curse. The helicopter was not just large, it was logistically monstrous. Moving it anywhere was an operation of military scale. It couldn't simply land in a field. It required reinforced concrete pads, vast clearings free of any debris that could be sucked into its cavernous intakes, and an army of support vehicles. Its rotor diameter meant it needed hangars of a size that simply didn't exist at most forward airfields. The Soviets would have to build an entirely new network of specialized bases, at astronomical cost, just to house and service a potential fleet. The cost-benefit analysis, even in a command economy that famously ignored such things, was becoming impossible to ignore. The complexity was another specter that haunted the design bureau. The synchronizing gearbox, that masterpiece of engineering that allowed the two rotor systems to dance in perfect, opposing harmony, was a maintenance nightmare. It required hundreds of hours of specialist labor for every hour of flight time. The wear and tear on the components was ferocious. The constant, immense forces at play meant that parts needed constant inspection, replacement, and recalibration. This was not a machine for a war of attrition, it was a precision instrument, a scalpel in a world that planned for sledgehammers. The sheer volume of specialized high-tensile steel, titanium, and advanced alloys required for each airframe was staggering, sucking resources from other, more numerous and more reliable aircraft programs like the Mi-6 and the emerging Mi-10. But the most fatal blow was not mechanical or economic, it was strategic. The entire genesis of the V-12 project, its raison d'etre, had been to solve a very specific and urgent problem: the dispersal and rapid deployment of the USSR's first-generation intercontinental ballistic missiles. These early ICBMs, like the cumbersome R-7, were behemoths, requiring massive, non-mobile launch facilities and components so large they could only be moved by rail or by a helicopter of unprecedented size. The V-12 was designed to break that logistical chain, to give the Soviet strategic rocket forces the mobility to hide their crown jewels. Then, the missile men rendered the helicopter men obsolete. In a stunningly rapid series of technological leaps, Soviet rocket design underwent a revolution. The new generation of ICBMs, like the UR-100 and the dreaded R-36, NATO codenamed SS-9 Scarp, were designed with mobility and survivability in mind. They used storable liquid or eventually solid fuels, and were housed in smaller, transportable canisters or deployed from hardened, underground silos. The components were smaller, more manageable. The heavy lifting required could now be handled by the smaller, cheaper, and already proven MIL Mi-10 inches Hark, a flying crane derivative of the Mi-6. The V-12's unique, world record-breaking capability was no longer unique, and more importantly, it was no longer critically needed. The project found itself in a bureaucratic limbo. It had succeeded brilliantly at its task, only to find that the task itself had vanished. The strategic landscape had shifted beneath its massive landing gear. The arguments of its proponents, that it could carry armored vehicles no other helicopter could, that it could move entire prefabricated structures, rang hollow in the ears of the Gosplan officials who held the purse strings. The Soviet Union, for all its bluster about monumental achievements, was ruthlessly pragmatic when it came to defense rubles. They could not justify the astronomical cost of mass-producing a machine that had become a solution in search of a problem. The V-12 was a masterpiece of engineering, but it was a masterpiece without a mission. The last giant. And so, the era of the Colossus ended not with a bang, but with a whisper of bureaucratic inertia. The order came down not as a dramatic cancellation, but as a slow freezing of funds, a quiet reassignment of personnel, a gradual winding down of the frantic activity that had surrounded the two prototypes. Only two V-12s were ever completed. The first, CCCP 21142, the record breaker. The second, CCCP 21141, its sibling, used for further flight testing and load demonstrations. These two aircraft, these twin titans, had flown flawlessly. They had humiliated Western assumptions and redefined the upper limits of rotary wing flight. They had broken world records that would stand for decades, unapproachable monuments in the record books. They had, for a brief, brilliant period, held NATO intelligence agencies in a state of rapt, terrified attention, forcing a fundamental rethink of Eurasian logistics. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared on that hazy Kazakh morning, they were grounded. The program was quietly cancelled. The vast, specialized tooling was placed in storage. The design documents were stamped, Soversheno Sekretno, top secret, and filed away in vaults. The brilliant engineers, men like Marat Tishchenko, were reassigned to more practical, more pressing projects. The V-12 did not die, it was put into a deep, administrative sleep. The helicopters that had once symbolized the zenith of Soviet engineering ambition, the brute force answer to every impossible question, became museum pieces almost overnight. One was transported to the Monino Air Force Museum, outside Moscow, where it sits to this day, parked silently alongside Tu-95 Bears and MiG-25 Foxbats, a static testament to a different, more audacious path not taken. The other found a home at the MIL helicopter plant in Pankovo, a company trophy, a reminder of what they could do when the state gave them a blank check and an impossible dream. But analysts in the West never forgot it. The V-12, the Homer, left an indelible scar on the Western strategic psyche. It was a permanent data point, proof that the Soviet engineering machine was capable of leaps of breathtaking, almost reckless, ambition. It served as a constant reminder that the other side of the Iron Curtain could not be judged by Western standards of practicality or cost analysis. They had looked at the laws of physics and, for a moment, had believed they could issue a decree to change them. The two hulking prototypes, silent in their museums, were not just relics of a cancelled program. They were a warning from the past, a whisper from an alternate future that almost was, a permanent statement that for a few years in the heart of the Cold War, the Soviets had built a helicopter so massive that NATO had refused to believe it was real. And in doing so, they had built a legend. In the decades that have passed, the story of the MiL V-12 has not faded into the dry pages of aviation history textbooks. Instead, it has calcified into legend, a story passed down not in official reports, but in the hangars, officers' clubs, and engineering symposiums of the world. It has become a ghost story for pilots and aeronautical engineers, a tale told with a kind of reverent disbelief. It is the story of the helicopter that shouldn't have flown. The legend thrives on its defiance of a fundamental truth that every student of aeronautics learns, that flight is a negotiation with physics, a constant, delicate balance of forces where compromise is the only constant. The V-12 did not negotiate. It did not compromise. It was an edict, a statement of power so absolute it seemed to bend the very rules of aerodynamics to its will. The legend speaks of its sheer presence, the way its shadow didn't just fall on the ground, but seemed to consume it. The way its sound was not a noise, but a physical phenomenon, a deep, chest-resonant thrumming that could be felt from miles away, a sensation described by one eyewitness as hearing the earth itself hum. It is spoken of as the machine that operated on a different scale of reality. Where other helicopters battled turbulence, the V-12's immense mass simply ignored it, plowing through rough air with the impervious stability of an ocean liner in a choppy sea. The synchronization of its counter-rotating rotors, a mechanical problem of such nightmarish complexity, is described in the legend not as an engineering solution, but as an act of faith, a perfect, harmonious ballet performed by two spinning giants that, by all rights, should have torn each other apart. It was, the story goes, the Soviet giant that existed not by the permission of physics but in defiance of it. Most Cold War myths were exaggerations. The bomber gap, the missile gap, these were often phantoms born of fear and flawed intelligence. The Red Mercury, super weapon, the hypersonic spy planes, the death rays, these were the stuff of paranoid fantasy. But the V-12 was different. This one wasn't a myth. It was not an exaggeration. It was a fact, documented, measured, and certified on the world stage. The MiL V-12 was real. Its aluminum and steel bones sit in a museum you can visit. The film of its flight exists in archives you can request. It flew. And in the one metric that matters most in the brutal, unforgiving world of heavy-lift aviation, pure, unadulterated lift capacity, it remains unmatched. Its shadow is long, and it falls across every modern heavy-lift helicopter designed since. The American CH-53K King Stallion, a formidable and technologically sublime machine, is the product of decades of advancement in composites, avionics, and engine technology. Yet, for all its sophistication, it can lift roughly half of what the V-12 hoisted over 50 years ago. The Russian Mi 26 inches Halo, the largest and most powerful helicopter in serial production in the world today, a machine that itself seems impossibly large, is the direct, pragmatic descendant of the V-12. But it, too, lives in its predecessor's shadow, a slightly smaller, more efficient, and more practical echo of the original Colossus. Every designer who sits down to draft a new heavy lifter must first confront the ghost of the V-12, its record a towering, seemingly unassailable peak on the landscape of aviation achievement. No one has beaten its record. The number, 44,205 kilograms to 2,255 meters, stands in the FAI record books like a monument from a lost civilization. More tellingly, no one has dared to build its equal. The economic and strategic conditions that birthed the V-12 were unique, perfect storm of Cold War paranoia and centralized, resource-oblivious command. In today's world, governed by cost-benefit analyses and network-centric warfare, the sheer, brutalist ambition of the V-12 is unthinkable. It remains the ultimate expression of a certain kind of power, the power to simply will a thing into existence because it can be done, regardless of the cost. It is the undisputed, and likely forever, king. The helicopter NATO thought was impossible. The ultimate impact of the MiL V-12 was not on the battlefield, for it never saw combat. It was not in logistics, for its operational career was brief. Its most profound and lasting impact was psychological. It forced the strategists, analysts, and engineers of NATO to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth they had long resisted. The Soviets were not just copying Western designs. They were not merely playing catch-up in a technological race defined by others. Sometimes, in their secret design bureaus, on their vast drawing boards, they were dreaming bigger. Much bigger. The V-12 was the physical proof. While Western design philosophy was increasingly trending towards sophistication, miniaturization, and efficiency, the Soviet approach, as embodied by the V-12, was one of monumental scale and overwhelming power. It was a different school of thought, one that asked not, how can we make this more elegant? But, how can we make it lift more? It was a glimpse into an alternate Cold War, a road not taken by the West. In this parallel reality, the superpowers did not fight with stealth and microchips, but with monsters of engineering, with brute force applications of physics that sought to overwhelm problems rather than cleverly circumvent them. The V-12 represented a world where a division could be moved by air, where geography was not a barrier but a convenience to be flown over, where the very concept of a front line could be rendered meaningless by the sudden, thunderous arrival of an entire armored company in your rear. It was a vision of warfare that was terrifying in its simplicity and scale. And although the V-12 itself flew only a handful of times, the world it revealed in those brief, stunning flights changed military thinking forever. It instilled in NATO a permanent sense of technological humility and a healthy fear of Soviet ingenuity. It taught them that the enemy's mind worked in ways they did not always anticipate, that their ambition could take forms that defied conventional wisdom. The Homer became a permanent fixture in threat assessments, a symbol of the need to expect the unexpected, to plan for the impossible. Because nothing challenges the imagination, nothing shatters preconceived notions and redefines the boundaries of the possible, like seeing the impossible itself. Take off. That single, smooth, unhurried ascent of the V-12 was more than a flight, it was a demonstration. It was the Soviet Union showing the world that their will was a tangible force, that their engineering could achieve the unbelievable. Long after the two prototypes were silenced, long after the program was cancelled and the documents sealed, the image of that giant rising, with the calm confidence of a machine half its size, continued to haunt the corridors of power in the West. It was a reminder that on the other side of the Iron Curtain, they didn't just build weapons. They built legends.